Okay. So I would like to introduce you my colleague here at Bogazici University, Ayfer Bartu Candan. So when we were organizing the summer school, fellows asked for an anthropologist specifically. And so here we have our anthropologist, and she is here at Bogazici University at the Department of Sociology, and her research interests mainly include urban anthropology, political anthropology, space, power, and gender. And she has very good work on Istanbul as well, and I'm sure she will be telling us a bit this during the session as well. So the floor is yours. Thanks.
First, I'll start by sitting, and then I'll stand up. Well, thank you very much for inviting me and insisting to have an anthropologist. But when I first heard that from Begüm, I was a bit worried because I wasn't sure what you were expecting, insisting on anthropology. And this worry has to do with usually the expectations from anthropology, because when people think of anthropology still, given the changes and transformations in the discipline and all the debate and so on, still when many people think of anthropology, they think of these exotic places, exotic people, you know, anthropologists telling us about all these stories that we're not familiar with. Well, I'm not going to do that. I'm not that kind of an anthropologist, and I don't think anthropology should be conducted in that way. And I'll certainly come back to this observation later on. Of course, I will be talking about different worlds and how a different world is possible and what anthropology could contribute to that debate. But certainly I'm not going to be talking about exotic places and people and exotic stories. And that is also usually the general division of labor in social sciences. I did my graduate studies in the States. The division of labor that exists there is sociologists deal with North America, anthropologists deal with the rest of the world. So, and sociologists talk about structures, economy, serious things, and anthropologists talk about the fancy, exotic, irrelevant things. You know, they add touches, colors, and texture, and so on. So that's not the kind of anthropology that I try to do. And anyway, we'll come back to that in a minute. So what I thought I could do is, bunu nasıl başlatabiliriz? I'm a Mac person, so I'm paralyzed when I. Sure. Huh? What? That's an exotic category? Okay. Where is it? Irmak is here. No? Yep. Oh, okay. Buna mı basıyorum ilerlemek? Tamam. Okay. So what I'm going to do is, well, I'll try to do several things at the same time. I hope this will work out. In the first maybe 10 minutes, maybe less than that, well, 10 minutes, what I'll do is give you a sense of, I'm not sure how much you're familiar with anthropology. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. But I'll try to give you a sense of what I call anthropology's engagement with the environment, how in an contribution that anthropology and the debates in anthropology can have for environmental discussions. And also, I was just telling Jason that I will have a different take on the Anthropocene debate, but we'll also talk about that later. So I thought I could just give you a sense of some of the things that are being debated within anthropology, obviously in conversation with geographers, political ecologists, and other fields as well. So give you a sense of that and mention a couple of names whose work I find quite exciting and interesting, although I don't agree with all of the things that they are doing. And then move on with some examples from the work that I've been conducting, not only in Istanbul, but I'll also talk about the other life that I had, previous work, research, and I'll give you through examples from my own research. I'll also try to demonstrate some of these contributions that I want to highlight. And I think many of the things that I want to just throw out will raise a series of questions that hopefully we can discuss during the discussion. So I'll start with this naming, labels, ecological anthropology versus environmental anthropology. So what do anthropologists call themselves when they work on environmental issues? So this is well, in anthropology, everything is very highly contested, and so on and so forth. This is also another contested area. What do we call ourselves? Well, many people refuse to call themselves anything. They just call themselves anthropologists working on environmental issues. But I think at least this distinction is actually very useful. Ecological anthropology versus environmental anthropology. Although just keeping in mind that many anthropologists even refuse to call themselves environmental anthropology because we have a trauma. I mean, every discipline has a trauma. The trauma has to do with the kind of ecological anthropology that has been conducted in 1960s and 70s. So this was really a traumatic and very tense relationship between social anthropologists and ecological anthropologists. Some of them were biological anthropologists, physical anthropologists, and physical anthropology, even the name itself, could be quite traumatic for many social anthropologists, because when you think of the history of anthropology, physical anthropology has this unfortunate history of being associated with racism, colonialism, and all those bad things. So, well, ecological anthropologists, some of them were physical anthropologists, biological anthropologists, and the kind of anthropology's engagement with environment was very much, had a particular vision in 1960s and 70s. It was very much a positivist science. It defined itself as a positivist science, and it didn't have anything to do with social anthropology. So it was mainly talking about adaptive strategies, how much rainfall will determine a certain cultural behavior. It's very much environmentally deterministic studies, and talking a lot about these adaptive strategies, how much calorie people intake of calories, how much they consume, and so on and so forth. And the unit of analysis was really the sort of a village, or their people, their own people, the sort of small-scale societies, and they could tell you everything you want to know about the physical conditions, the environmental conditions, with no relevance, with no concern whatsoever about questions of power, questions about the world system, questions about inequality, questions about gender. So that was really how ecological anthropology, or anthropologists who were dealing with some form of environmental issues, worked within that paradigm of 1960s and 70s. Well, when we look at more sort of contemporary anthropologists working on environmental issues, it's a completely different picture. And we're not talking about the same group of people who changed their minds. We're talking about a completely different groups of people, academics. So there is this emergence of I don't think it's a generational thing, but still a new generation of anthropologists dealing with environmental issues, but asking completely different kinds of questions. Very much influenced by geography, very much influenced by the world system, very much influenced by work of geographers, political ecologists, and so on. And I think geographers and political ecologists and economists also started learning a lot from anthropology. So there is this convergence of social scientists, I'm sure you're all familiar with that, that history, convergence of social scientists who, that's why political ecology is so attractive, because it brings together all these different disciplines. Geographers discovering, in a way, fieldwork methodology as a new methodology, sort of rediscovering anthropology. Anthropologists discovering geographers talking about space, place, things are happening in a place, there are histories, there's a global history, and so on. So the kind of environmental anthropology, I'm just using it as a shortcut, the kind of environmental anthropology or the kind of anthropology that I'll be talking about today is drastically different from this ecological anthropology of 1960s and 70s. So the kinds of questions that we are engaged now, this group of anthropologists, as I said, it's really, you can think of it as this area of political ecology, inequalities, gender, and so on. And there have been many influences there. Different theories about nature, science studies had a lot of impact in organizing this field. Development studies, well, feminist theory, environmental history, post-colonial studies, political ecology. So this environmental anthropology that is conducted now is very much, they feed on these different theories as well. So these are just a background information, influences, and the dramatic differences in the contemporary anthropology, the way we deal with environmental issues. Let me say a couple of things very briefly about, again, what kind of contributions, or what are the ongoing debates and issues that are that anthropology, the kind of anthropology that I just told you about, anthropology can bring to discussions of environmental issues. Well, one has to do with, I think, methodology. Fieldwork methodology, as I said, has been very attractive as a methodology, looking at everyday life practices, hearing the stories of ordinary people, how they go about in their daily lives, how they interact with the environment, what they do, what they believe in, how they live, how they are integrated into the world system, and so on. So this methodology, I think, again, we don't need a longer discussion on this at the moment, but this fieldwork methodology has been, I think, one of the important contributions when we think of anthropology and its engagement with the environment. And it brings in the stories of and the experiences of ordinary people in our discussions and debates about nature, environment, and so on. Because all these big concepts like social class, gender, they are very much lived experiences. I mean, we are talking about real people in specific historical settings doing things, right? So that is really, that sounds very mundane and ordinary, but that's really, I think, the power of anthropology as well. But there are a couple of other issues which I think I'll just list some of them. Contributions, discussions, and debates these are ongoing debates and ongoing research taking these questions seriously. One has to do with question of scale. We did come a long way from just talking about our little communities, face-to-face communities, villages. Anthropologists are famous, talking about their own villages, their own sites, and so on. Yes, we still do that, but obviously we're not under the impression that there is this tiny little locality that has nothing to do with the rest of the world. So there are various attempts by many anthropologists trying to problematize the scale. So we talk about this local-global nexus, so what it means to be local, what it means to be global, and the intersections between them, north and south, indigenous versus foreign, or indigenous or non-Western versus Western. So we actually problematize many of these, what some call question of scale. So these notions that people assume and people expect from anthropologists, this locality, let's hear about the local, right? So anthropologists, rather than assuming what local is or what locality is, we try to conduct work, or they try to demonstrate what we can say production of locality, the historical production of locality, and also production of globality. So rather than just understanding local and with its own histories and so on, and just thinking of global as something that is coming and just changing everything, so now we try to understand the production of both what we mean by globality, and I think Jason's talk was very informative in that sense. We can't just assume that. We need to historicize that. We need to talk about real actors. We need to talk about different forms that capitalism takes in different regions of the world. So we really started talking about, rather than assuming this distinction itself, talking about production of locality and production of globality. So rather than, again, talking about exotic, pristine, untouched people, again, thinking of Eric Wolf, people without history, and there were never in history people who haven't been untouched or haven't been part of either a regional or a global network of exchange, interaction, and so on. I mean, it took on different forms, obviously. So that's one of the, I think, contributions and interesting debates that's an ongoing debate in anthropology, and very interesting work and attempts to theorize these distinctions and question of scale. Another contribution, I think, or an important theme is, as I said, the sustained critique of romantic and essentialized images of the indigenous. Right? There has been this fascination with the indigenous way of doing things, non-Western way of doing things, and I'm not saying this to undermine the indigeneity. Is there such a word? Yeah. Or what the indigenous practices could contribute to our understanding of environment, ecology, and so on. But there is a very important danger of romanticizing and essentializing the indigenous. Right? That's why at the beginning I said that I'm not going to give you the sort of romanticized, exotic view of the indigenous. But this is something that I want to come back to in a minute, because there are so many very interesting attempts and experiments, I would say, to theorize what we mean by indigenous, what we mean by local. I mean, we're all aware that it's not a homogeneous thing, it's not a homogeneous entity. There are class differences, historical differences, regional differences. And there are many attempts to theorize what we mean by indigeneity and the contribution of that. So this is not a call for undermining the indigenous or the indigenous groups, but calling for a different kind of formulation and theorization of that. And also we have to keep in mind, I'm going to be very brief about this, that we have to keep in mind that especially when we look at some environmental movements in different parts of the world, many indigenous groups of people actually take up these essentialized images, and Spivak calls that strategic essentialism. They use it knowingly and consciously. So they portray a particular image of themselves to the world so that they can be visible, so that they can be heard in the world, because that's the only way they can be seen. So that's another interesting discussion that we might come back to. But this is sustained critique of romantic essentialized indigeneity. And emphasis on contested nature of natures. So we are aware that there are multiple natures, different ways in which different groups relate to natures, and contestation is an important part of that. But we also need to be aware of, I mean exactly as Jason said, that's how capitalism works. I mean, contestation, which came out as I think, a very progressive concept, it has been immediately appropriated by World Bank, for example. I mean, unfortunately, I did work with World Bank people at some point in my life, and contestations now have become stakeholders, right? All of a sudden, you have a list of groups of people with different relation with nature, environment, and now they become, in the more mainstream international agencies, they become stakeholders. So that's another sort of interesting area there. So, and lastly, interest in globalization and in the transnationality of movements and discourses. So different attempts in understanding both the environmental movements and discourses, how they travel, the global nature of it, and what we mean by transnationality of all of these things. So this is very briefly just to give you a sense of some debates, contributions, and themes that might be relevant, and I do want to elaborate on some of them later on. But now I want to give examples from two works by anthropologists. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with these names, but these are people, I think, who engage with these issues quite a lot. Especially this question of scale, local, global, north-south, and also this question of indigeneity and different ways of theorizing that. One of them is Anna Singh. How many of you are familiar with her works? Yeah, mushrooms. Well, she doesn't only work on mushrooms, but I find her work really inspiring. I disagree with some of her analysis, and I find some of her work quite inaccessible in terms of jargon and so on, and I think that's a problem. But I find her work quite inspiring in terms of simultaneously trying to understand the production of locality. This project on Matsutake mushrooms stories, that's the website of the project. You just click on one of these places. So what she tries to do is tracing, I find this in some ways similar to what Sidney Mintz did with sugar, in a way. Sort of trying to trace the story of these mushrooms, the meanings attributed to them, how in different parts of the world people engage with this, and how this becomes a commodity in the global market. So you can actually click on these stories and get a sense of how people engage with this environment, what it means to collect these mushrooms, and how they become part of the global commodity chain. So she has also other interesting, and she's now also involved in, I think, a very interesting project on the Anthropocene. I'll come back to that later. The other anthropologist, again, how many of you are familiar with Elizabeth Povinelli's work? She's another very interesting anthropologist, I think, who has been working on recently more explicitly environmental issues. And the most recent project that she's involved in is actually an attempt to again theorize this indigeneity and facilitating the indigenous populations that she's been working with in Australia, giving them working with them for them to be able to express themselves and their relationship with the environment, not in a romanticized and an exotic way, but this is a project, Carabing project, multimedia project that we can talk about later on if you want. But these are interesting anthropologists, I think just a few, naming a few, but dealing with these issues that I've just mentioned, these questions of scale, indigeneity, globalization, transnationality, and so on. The others, I'll skip parts of this because I want to move on to Istanbul part. Well, we can come back to this in the question and answer. Yeah, exciting stuff. Yeah. Well, the Anthropocene debate and the urban political ecology. The Anthropocene debate is also, I think, interesting in terms of I just want to say a couple of things about these, and then I want to move on to Istanbul research and engage with these questions within that context. And I think that will also give you a background, because I think you have field trips to some of these sites, and you will be talking about Istanbul case as an interesting case, to say the least. Well, the Anthropocene debate, the way, when I was listening to Jason, I was a bit surprised by the mutually exclusive distinction that he made between sort of capitalism or Capitalocene, I can't pronounce that word, and Anthropocene. The way the Anthropocene debate is translated into anthropology is something a bit different. The way many anthropologists have been hearing this debate is reconfiguration of the relationship between the physical and the social, the physical and the cultural. I told you about this sort of traumatic relationship of the physical anthropology, the physical things, and social and cultural. But the Anthropocene debate, and I think some of the discussions in political anthropology, opened up a new space within social anthropology, where social anthropologists, in a way, restarted talking to, having conversations with biologists, for example. I mean, trying to overcome the trauma and re-talking, having new conversations, and that relationship between the physical and the social and cultural is being reconfigured, I think. And that part I find very interesting. And also, well, we know that, well, of course, the Anthropocene debate brings in human agency at the center of the debate, but as anthropologists well know, we know that human beings, we can't just talk about this homogeneous entity of human beings. I mean, there are differences, there are regional differences, class differences, and so on. And human beings do things, right? And we need to understand capitalism is one of the important forces there. I mean, important aspects of, well, or one of the very important things that they do, they have been doing. And they, obviously, there are certain actors associated with that. So the Anthropocene debate actually opens up a space within social anthropology to rethink about capitalism, to historicizing capitalism, talking about the kinds of things that human beings have been doing in the world. So in that sense, I don't find them really mutually exclusive, but so in that sense, I find that debate very interesting and inspiring for anthropology and the anthropological work that we do. And it also raises for anthropologists the question of responsibility. So who have been doing this? Who are these people? Because capitalism, yes, it's a system, but it is a system implemented by certain actors. So that brings in, I think, an interesting discussion within anthropology. And urban political ecology, again, that's another interesting field, or the way political ecology has been, what I call, translated into urban anthropology, and that is, in a way, sort of the area that I've been working on. It raises really interesting questions about urban, what we call urban, and this completely being very critical of this distinction between nature or rural and urban, nature and urban, an attempt to understand creation of natures and different kinds of natures in the urban context. So that's, so these are really background themes and issues that anthropologists have been dealing with. So what I'm going to do is actually continue talking about Istanbul case as a way of again demonstrating how, or in my research and how part of this research I collaborated with other people, how we try to engage with some of the questions that urban political ecology has been raising in the context of Istanbul. And usually the expectations in urban anthropology, when you look at the history of urban anthropology and urban sociology, the expectation is, again, similar to expectations with anthropology in general. The expectation is to study down, studying the poor people, studying the marginal groups in the city. So when people thought of urban anthropology, they always, that was, again, immediate division of labor. Well, if you're an anthropologist, you go to the squatter settlements and you work there. Again, I'm not saying that that's not important, but I think in terms of production of knowledge, that raises a series of questions about what kind of knowledge is produced and for whom, and what are the kinds of things that we take for granted. So the kind of work that I've been conducting in Istanbul, actually, well, I've conducted work in squatter settlements, but also in gated communities, and trying to understand both of them simultaneously, and the relationship between the two, and especially when we think of environmental issues, we have to study up. We really need to understand the nature of urban problems, because whenever urban problems are debated in the context of Istanbul or any big city, it's always the poor who is polluting the environment. It's always the squatter settlements who are using electricity, who are using inappropriate sort of portion of water, polluting the water reserves, and so on. But places like gated communities, places that upper classes occupy, have been aestheticized, and they have been normalized, and they have been really kept out of the equation when we're especially talking about environmental issues and environmental problems in the cities. So those were really some of the background issues that we had in mind when we started this project on Istanbul. So let me move on with some observations about Istanbul and elaborate on some of these issues as we go along. Well, what I'm going to do is give you a sense of series of projects that are ongoing in Istanbul. I mean, Istanbul, I don't know whether you had a chance to go around a bit, but it's like a construction site. Something is happening, and that's not a coincidence because the whole economy is actually run on the sort of construction sector, but there are different types of projects, and I will be more brief on some, but elaborate on some in terms of the environmental impact and why we need to care about these projects. Well, if you were here a month earlier, probably I would be more pessimistic, but now, after the elections, I'm a bit more optimistic, and we'll see how many of these projects will really be actualized. Some of them are already actualized, but we're so happy that, it's the 13% that made us happy, but that was a very important, very significant number, yeah. Well, the mega projects, I'll just, one set of projects are what we might call mega projects, and Istanbul is not unique in that sense. I mean, it might be a bit more crazy, but it's not unique in the sense that that in terms of the contemporary sort of way in which capitalism operates. I mean, mega projects are really important there, and same in Istanbul. One project, Kanal Istanbul, and the Prime Minister at the time called it a crazy project, and it's a crazy project, is in terms of its scale and in terms of what it tries to do. Well, you can't see it properly. So that's the real Bosphorus, the existing one, right? And there are two options to open a canal either here or there between the Black Sea and Marmara Sea. I mean, it is, in terms of the scale and so on, it's really a crazy project. And the estimated cost, $15 billion US. Well, I'm very hopeful that it won't happen. And many environmental activists have been talking about the environmental impact of this, obviously. I mean, completely changing the whole geography of the city. And we all know that this is actually for urban development. And the Prime Minister at the time also said very explicitly that he wants to create a second Istanbul, as if we didn't have enough, first Istanbul. So we can go back to some of these mega projects if you want at the end. I just want to be very brief because I want to talk about some other things. But this is just to give you a sense of the kind of also environmental struggles that people have been running from one demonstration to another and trying to make sense of this all. The third airport, so that's supposed to be the location of that, which is also related with the third bridge that is it still being built? It is, yeah. Anyway. So the third airport, and that area, the third airport and the third bridge, you might sort of vaguely see there, it's really the last green areas in the city. It will completely sort of destroy the whole sort of ecology there. Estimated cost $29 billion. It's huge, mega. And the third bridge, obviously this that's supposed to be the third bridge. I mean, we can raise series of questions that are extremely relevant also for political ecology. Who needs that bridge? Who needs that kind of private transportation? Is it really meaningful to invest in that kind of transportation rather than others? Whose need is that, and so on? And also in terms of the impact of mega projects, there's a whole sort of literature on that, which are very relevant for Istanbul case as well. But so these are one set of projects that are ongoing in Istanbul. The other set has to do with, I'm not sure how many of these will be really implemented. Building sort of 7 skyscrapers representing 7 hills of Istanbul, sort of creating a small Dubai there. Privatization of a very controversial Galata Port project, privatization of this area and catering to cruise tourism. and this is also very much related, I think, with privatization of many public spaces in the city. So this is one line of contestation in the city, as many other cities. Well, famous Taksim Square military barracks, rebuilding that's the Gezi Park. Well, park is still there. So, but this was the project, the pedestrianization of Taksim Square and building rebuilding the military barracks as shopping mall. Well, at some point it was termed urban museum, city museum. Well, it's still a park. So, these mega projects, you should also get the sense that the way we learn here about these mega projects is actually you wake up one morning and you are told that there's going to be this kind of a project. So this decision-making process is actually part of the environmental struggles in Istanbul context as well. Another type of series of projects that I will spend a bit more time on is what has been referred to as urban transformation projects, UTPs. You might sort of hear this over and over again. And they also take on different forms. These are, the scale is very, very different. One kind of scale, one type of urban transformation projects is to invite star architects to Istanbul and give them literally helicopter tour of some of these neighborhoods. And this is a neighborhood on the, well, it doesn't look this way now. It's a very industrial, working class neighborhood on the Asian side. And when I'm talking about neighborhood, this is supposed to be Kartal. I'm talking about approximately 100,000 people. So that's the scale of the neighborhood that I'm talking about. So Zaha Hadid, the Iraqi-British star architect, she was invited to Istanbul, given a helicopter tour of the neighborhood, and she was asked to design a new neighborhood there. Well, with one exception that, you know, she didn't need to take into account 100,000 people who are already living there, right? So this is a working class neighborhood. So this is the kind of design, the futuristic design that she came up with. Obviously very much a gentrification project, and there is no account of what's going to happen to these 100,000 people. I mean, it's one thing when an architect has a vision, but it's another thing when the mayor of Istanbul declares that this is going to be the future of this neighborhood. So this is still a pending project. I mean, hopefully it will still pen there. Another, again, similar kind of urban transformation projects. This is you might have, this also got international attention. This is the Roman neighborhood Sulukule. It's not an illegal settlement. It's just a poor Roman population live in the center of the city. Sort of rehabilitation. I mean, there are these fancy words for these transformation projects. Rehabilitation of the neighborhood. They also make use of some laws which talks about preservation of heritage and so on. But you could see that the new Sulukule, these people could not really afford to live in these places. So the new Sulukule, they have been dislocated or relocated to really out of nowhere up there, Toki, Kayabaşı Konda. So they used to be here, so they are relocated there to this kind of housing. These are mass housing administration, so-called public housing projects. But the interesting thing about, I think, the contemporary government is that the argument about these urban transformation projects, especially this one, and in a minute I'll show some squatter settlement, so-called rehabilitation projects. The argument is that they're not saying that, well, we're going to do this in spite of you. The argument is that, well, we are doing this to upgrade the housing conditions of the urban poor. But what is actually happening in practice is that these people are relocated because there is no way that they could either afford these houses because they need to buy these new houses, and they are relocated to somewhere else in the city. I mean, there is no way that they could actually sustain a living there. So this is the new Sulukule, and similar kinds of projects in the city, in Beyoğlu, poor population sort of renting these places, especially sort of the Kurdish migrants, transsexual sex workers, some students. So this part of this neighborhood, so this is going to be the new Tarlabaşı. And you could easily see that there is no way that the existing population could actually survive. So it's a gentrification project. But the ones that I want to say a bit more, and I think more relevant to our discussion, previous discussion about contribution of anthropology, is that squatter settlement transformation projects. Gecekondu, that literally means built overnight. That's the squatter settlement in Turkish, like favelas and so on. I mean, Gecekondu's story is really interesting in Istanbul because these squatter settlements, while on paper they are referred to as illegal settlements, right? But the legality and illegality of squatter settlements are highly problematic, and it's a very confusing picture, actually. Because the way squatter settlements worked in Istanbul case is that, I mean, I always argue that Gecekondu has been the state's urban housing policy. You can't have whole neighborhoods built without the state knowing about it, right? I mean, we're talking about huge neighborhoods. So the way it worked was that it worked as a sort of a redistributive system. So Istanbul, when it was an industrial city, you needed cheap labor, right? So there's agricultural transformation, so people migrate to the city, they need housing, they need labor, so you need that labor in the city, right? In the 70s, well, 60s, 70s, so you need that labor. And these people need housing, right? But the owners of the factories are not willing to provide the housing. The state is not willing to provide the housing. So Gecekondu squatter settlement is actually the solution to this housing problem. And right before local elections, the state, the municipalities retrospectively legalize some of these neighborhoods. They give them temporary papers or title deeds and so on. And that's how urban politics operated for years in Istanbul. Not only in Istanbul, but in many cities in Turkey. But things changed from sort of 2000 onwards. And I won't get into a detailed discussion about that. Çağlar Keyder calls it sort of the urban land properly became a commodity in this period. And the AKP, the ruling party, actually changed its policies about squatter settlements. So instead of don't ask, don't tell policy or urban politics running on this sort of retrospectively legalizing these settlements, they introduced these urban transformation projects with the argument that they're going to upgrade the housing conditions of the urban poor, and the squatter settlements, you can't, there's a social stratification also within squatter settlements. Some of them are in better conditions, some of them are semi-legal and so on. So it's a very complicated picture. But the squatter settlement transformation projects, the way they operate is that, so the mass housing administration, you don't really have a choice if you don't have some form of a title deed. So you have to make an agreement with mass housing administration. So your house is demolished and you sign an agreement with mass housing administration, and you are relocated to these so-called public housing projects, and you pay the installments, the rest of the money for the house in 20 or 25 years subsidized installments. Okay. But here the assumption is that everyone is able to pay that installment, but I'll come back to that in a minute. So what happens with this land is, so they're open to more middle class or upper middle class residential housing. So it's not that they're not unrelated. So the places that they leave it's open for construction and for constructing middle class and upper middle class residential settlements. I'll come back to this squatter settlements and what happens to these people when they're relocated, and why that's a problem, and why we need to, and where environmental struggles actually come into the picture. So these are the set of urban transformation projects that are implemented by the state. There are also other kinds of residential settlements in the city that cater to upper classes or upper middle classes and some middle classes, which take the form of gated communities in the city. But they have been, as I said, they have been normalized. Very few social scientists actually conduct research on these gated communities. And I think they pose an incredible environment. They are environmental disasters in many ways. But their impact on the environment and their relationship to the city really becomes invisible in the sense that Maria Kaika talks about it. I mean, it becomes as if they have nothing to do with the rest of the city, as if they are sort of aesthetically, they are normalized, they are the way to go. And I'll give you several examples, and I'm using the real names of these gated communities. Water is a huge, big thing. So there are different ways in which, I mean, I have been interested in different natures that are created within these gated communities. And these natures are also used in different ways. One is in marketing these gated communities, because they promise, very similar to some ones in Latin America, India, Los Angeles, and so on, they promise nature, right? They promise you a life in the middle of nature. But the kind of nature that they are talking about is very much a simulated nature. Well, I'm very much aware that there is no pristine nature and all that debate and so on, but this is a problem. This is simulated nature, and water is very, very important in the water and forest. These are two very important aspects of this promise of a green lifestyle. And more, these gated communities are promoted as green settlements. And this is not problematized. Bosphorus city, so you have a simulation of Bosphorus. You can just imagine the amount of water that is pumped in to create this Bosphorus city. I mean, there wasn't water there. And also the maintenance cost of this for the rest of the city. Well, Aqua City, lagoon houses, these are all artificial lakes that are created, and obviously in order to do something for the mosquitoes, there's an enormous amount of chemicals, pesticides, so maintenance fees are enormous. Terrace gardens, so more and more, as I said, these gated communities are very much, they are marketed as sort of promising a life outside of the problems and the dirt and the whatever of the city, promising a green, promising a life in nature, and what they call, non-embarrassingly, in harmony with nature. And this is not problematized. This is taken as what some people call sort of green aesthetics, right? This is the way to go. Terrace gardens. I mean, this huge, very controversial, illegal shopping mall, Zorlu Center, is, I think it does have a LEED certificate or something. So it promotes itself as a green shopping mall. I think that's an oxymoron. You can't have a green shopping mall. And these terrace gardens, I mean, this project, this gated community, it promotes, it talks about how much of its energy it produces, how it is green and so on. And I think the extreme form of this is this project. You know, how natural we are. The name of the project is Resim Istanbul, Picture Istanbul, and it's promoted in this way, and this is, yeah. A new kind of settlement also emerged, which I think has a different kind of relationship with nature, creation of nature. This is more than a gated community. This is actually the new trend now in Istanbul. You have everything there. It's a compound in a way. You have the residences, you have the offices, you have the shopping malls within the compound, right? And this is called Vadi Istanbul, Valley Istanbul, and it is constructed within a valley. So obviously getting rid of many of the trees there. But it is promoted as Valley Istanbul, so wouldn't you want to live in Valley Istanbul, right? Another one, I think this was stopped, trying to be built within a state forest. Maslak 1453 is the conquest of Istanbul. But 1453 also points to something else. That is the length of the shopping strip within, it is 1453 meters of shopping strip that it has within it, pointing to that. So there's something interesting in terms of this creation of new kinds of natures. What is happening is actually many of these places are designed. Actually, there's a very good paper about Berlin on this. There's this new design practice that we observe in cities, and I think it's interesting to think in terms of environmental impact and also relationship with environment and nature. This new architectural design, it designs spaces as if they are open and public spaces, right? So this shopping strip is actually, it's called street, right? But there's nothing street about it. It is within this compound. You can't just walk in there. You can't, not anyone can walk in there. It's highly regulated, but it is designed as if it is an open space, right? But it's actually a private space. So it's actually more than privatization of public space, but it's creating and designing new private spaces. This is another example of what I'm trying to show. This is Meydan shopping mall. Meydan means plaza, right? And this is, again, designing a shopping mall as if this is a public space, as if this is an open space. But this is actually a highly regulated space. So there are many sort of security people around, private security people around, and so on. This is very interesting because this is located in, on the other side, Asian side, Ümraniye, where there are gated communities and also squatter settlements. And on Sundays, it's really an interesting experience because many sort of young people from the squatter settlements would want to come to this shopping mall. And there are always tensions, who gets in and who's out. And it's very difficult to sort of regulate that in this kind of a so-called open space or spaces that are designed as public spaces. Other trend within shopping malls, this is within İstinye Park shopping mall, sort of an upscale shopping mall. It's called this fake tree, fake lighting, and it is called a coffee, more sort of ordinary coffee shop. It's called that, and coffee shop, and people sit, they know that this is a fake tree, fake lighting, and so on. It's highly regulated spaces where you enjoy a particular kind of nature, right? And another shopping mall, and you have within it a place, the whole food court is called mahalle, neighborhood, right? This is within the shopping mall, again, highly regulated and so on. So this gives you, I think, a sense of, how much time do we have until?
If you want to leave half an hour for discussion, you have 5 minutes.
5 minutes? Oh my God, okay. All right, so this gives you a sense of the urban scene in a way, the settlements, the shopping malls, and this really urgent need, I think, to problematize rather than squatter settlements themselves, but these kinds of gated communities, the kinds of shopping malls that actually market themselves as sort of aesthetically pleasing, green, and so on. And we conducted research in 2 different parts of Istanbul. There, that is the gated communities. I won't get into it, but this is how it looks. This is sort of one gated community. This is also interesting urban phenomena. I mean, what do you call this place? It's one gated community next to another. So it's not a neighborhood. It's not a town. It's just a new urban phenomena. It's one gated community. This is just one. With its own facilities in it. They also have educational facilities. So you don't really need to leave this space. I'll skip, and they have their own sort of private schools, private hospitals, shopping malls, restaurants, and supermarkets, and so on. So you don't need to leave this compound, I don't know what to call it. I mean, really sort of set of gated communities. But this kind of urban development is rarely problematized. Again, that is the norm, and that is perceived to be environmentally sustainable, and it's also marketed as such. But I want to go back to one of these urban transformation projects where we conducted research, and go back to this point about indigeneity, the local, and what is it that we are actually losing in this process. So the challenge is, how can we talk about the locality, indigeneity, and in this context, squatter settlements, without romanticizing them, but still providing a critique of the existing urban transformation project? So that's really the challenge that I want to talk about. So so this is where we can skip this. There's another sort of star architect project here. So this is the area that I'll be talking about. So there is an Olympic stadium there. Some of you might know that Turkey has this craze for bidding for the Olympics for years. We never managed to get it. Hopefully we won't, because there's a whole literature on the impact of the Olympics on the cities. But I think Istanbul will still bid for the Olympics. So there's an Olympic stadium there. So this project was promoted as cleaning up the area around the Olympic stadium. So whenever you hear this cleaning up, you can assume that there's going to be a group of people who will be relocated, right? So they have been relocated from that blue area to this black area, with the same kind of mechanism that I just mentioned, this urban transformation projects, from the squatter settlement so this is the Olympic Stadium, so we were there right during the demolition of the squatter settlement. So this is sort of how it looks like. I mean, there is nothing, obviously, to romanticize about, especially some of these squatter settlements. This area, Ayazma, it has been predominantly populated by Kurdish migrants, starting with 1980s, but in 1990s, the population sort of exploded. So they have been settled there. Well, they settled there. This is right next to an industrial zone, and the reason why I'm saying there is nothing to romanticize about this neighborhood is that this was the squatter settlement in Istanbul where the infant mortality has been the highest. I mean, there is nothing, even that fact itself tells you that there's nothing to romanticize about it. But there is something very important that we've been losing in this process of relocation and so-called upgrading of this squatter settlement. So, and I'll just say a couple of things about that. So these people, so it has been demolished, and they have, they moved to this public housing project. Not all of these blocks, but some of them. So this is I think one of the other crazy projects. This was one of the first urban transformation projects of squatter settlements. So we are talking about a predominantly Kurdish population living in this squatter settlement, and they had their gardens. So we're talking about a very poor population who relied heavily on their gardens for survival, right? So whenever these are people who don't have regular jobs and their income is not stable at all, so they rely heavily on the gardens to sustain themselves, right? So they are moved to these apartment buildings where they don't have any garden to use. So we are talking about a group of Kurdish population. In the middle of this, the surrounding area is known to be ultra right-wing nationalist neighborhood, right? So you move this population there, right? An urban poor population there with no gardens. You move them there, and you also put. So this is how it looks. The quality of construction is awful too, and so these were the buildings that they were moved to. They had to move. So the surrounding area is ultra-nationalist neighborhood, and the green dots, well, on top of that, you move the police housing there, and guess what happens, right? So you have the Kurdish population with police housing in the middle of the compound, surrounded with ultranationalist right-wing population. I mean, I'm even embarrassed to give this as an example in my Introduction to Sociology course. I mean, this is, guess what happens, right? Obviously, it's extremely tense the minute they move there, ethnic violence. I mean, it becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, obviously. Then the argument is that, well, see, the Kurds do not know how to live in an apartment building. There are tensions, there are fights, and so on. But another thing, I mean, this is really the expected outcome. But another thing that I'm more interested in, well, I'm also interested in this, but more interested in is that, so this is overnight, this population, and this is not unique to this example, but you can think of this as relevant to other urban transformation projects, especially of the urban poor, but these people become poorer overnight. Why? Because they have a very limited, unstable income, right? But in the squatter settlements that they were living, so they had the gardens, so they could actually use the gardens to sustain themselves. They also relied heavily on an informal credit system, veresiye. So they go to the market, probably they know the owner, not probably, they knew the owner of the market, so they would pay him whenever they had the money. Well, here, there is no way they could do that. I mean, the surrounding neighborhood, no one would do that. I mean, it obviously based on a trust relationship, right? I mean, they don't trust them. So they don't have the gardens. So overnight, they become poorer. Right? And literally, some of the families that we were visiting there were starving. They would just drink tea all day long with lots of sugar, just to keep them going. So, lots of ethnic tension, and this is a highly regulated space. There is actually a management office there, and these are flyers at the entrance of each apartment building, just telling you rules of living in an apartment building. So it's more like the sort of civilizing mission, right? And in terms of the environment, nature there, so this is the nature you have there. It's again highly regulated. I mean, these small green spaces, I mean, one of the most sort of popular way that many of the women in these squatter settlements socialize would gather in front of their houses. So what they started doing here to exchange information, some of them are illiterate, some of them do not speak Turkish, they would gather in front of the apartment houses on this green land, plot. And the next time we went there, it was forbidden for them to gather there. So they just sort of, they said this is part of paysage work there, you can't sit there. So this is very much actually in line with the kind of nature that is created by the municipality. I mean, our prime minister at the time, the president now, he would yell and scream about how environmentalist he is. You know, he counts the number of flowers they've planted, right? He makes a point about how much money they spend on this paysage of the city and so on, and expect us to be impressed by that. So there's a different kind of nature that is being created there, and the kind of thing that these women can do there is actually they go outside of the compound to live, trying to live there. I mean, socialize there. So what happens to the squatter settlement that they left? So they became poorer overnight and so on. And guess what happened to the squatter settlement that they left? This is what happened there. So this is another gated compound that is built. And ironically, the owner of the construction company, he's really good friends with the current government. Ironically, his slogan, the slogan of his construction company is, everyone in this country deserves a good living. That's the slogan. Well, this is not Istanbul, don't worry, I'll just wrap up with this. This is actually, this is another crazy project by this, in quotes, environmentalist businessman in China. He's given many environmental awards. Because he's producing, I think, environmentally friendly air conditioning systems and so on. This is his project called Sky City. And what he proposes is that this is not completed because it's just too expensive. It's huge. It's 220 stories or something. But what he's proposing is that he proposes this as the environmental solution to urban problems. The way this will work is that it will create its own energy, and it will have all of the facilities within the compound, within this. So you don't need to leave. So you have the shopping mall, the educational facilities, residences, and so on. So you get rid of the traffic problem, you get rid of the air pollution. So this is his dream project, right? I mean, obviously it sounds crazy, extreme, and so on, but I think what is happening in Istanbul, as in many other cities, is actually, this is really where we are going. So this might sound crazy, but some of the compounds that I'm showing you are actually operating in this way. I mean, not that they are resolving urban problems, but they also, many of them believe that they do have sort of very environmentally friendly compounds and solving urban problems and not dealing with it, and with no consciousness of their impact on the rest of the city and so on. That becomes invisible. So what is it really that we need to really, without romanticizing the squatter settlements, how they survive and so on, we really need to capture the everyday practices and how people have been interacting with the environment, and in what ways that was actually sustainable compared to these. These are really questions that we need to address. And I think many of these issues became very explicit during Gezi Park, and probably there has been only one thing that I agreed with the ex-prime minister when he said, well, the Gezi Park is not about a couple of trees. And I agree with him, and that's very rare that I agree with him. It wasn't only about trees. It wasn't only an environmental movement in that sense, but it was actually about urban existence. What kind of urbanity that we want, and who decides about that? What are the decision-making processes? So I think that's what the Gezi struggle was about. And as many of you know, it was violent, and but it was one of the most. Now we're being nostalgic about it, but it was a very interesting movement, I think. I mean, we still need some. We need different terms and time reflection. We need to make some reflection on what the movement was about, the kind of solidarity, who was coming together, and why, and how, and so on. And let me end with, as I said, it was violent. Let me end with an image that some of you will be familiar with. This is a group of young people who were killed during the demonstrations. This is an artistic depiction of them together. I mean, they were not together when they were killed, but this is a new sort of imagination for the city. Let me stop here.
Hello, I'm Felipe. I'm part of ENTITLE. I'm from Brazil and working in Coimbra, Portugal, and work also with indigenous groups in Brazil. So I was interested to hear a bit more of the ideas of indigeneity as you proposed in the beginning. As I could understand, I don't know if that's the way, but like the locals, the local communities who has been displaced, you are seeing them as indigenous communities, and they are transformed to poor, they're impoverished. And so this is like a transitory condition to something, and then they can regain their indigeneity, or they can reclaim another indigeneity, they can fight back for another way to live. I mean, transform back from poor to another condition. I don't know if it's. I
don't want to sit anymore. I think I understand your question, but the problem is that almost none of the families that we've met in the when they were in the squatter settlement and after they relocated, none of the families that we've met, and this is very common in many of these projects, they could not stay in Istanbul. They had to leave the city. For various reasons. One has to do with the ethnic tension. The other has to do with the poverty. They can't afford these places. And for the relocations to really far ends of the city, they relied on networks to find jobs. So there was no way that they could actually find jobs in the new places that they moved to, like the Roman population. Well, the Roman population, some of them moved back in the city. But the ones that I showed you, the Kurdish population, none of the families that we've met managed to survive, and that was very predictable, actually, in the public housing project. So one of the arguments that I've been making, and some other colleagues have also been making, is that this urban transformation project, directly or indirectly, is actually a project of pushing the urban poor out of the city. I mean, obviously you can't just send the urban poor out of the city, but this is what happens at the end, right? So,
They are indigenous in their concept. They are indigenous.
Well, see, I'm not that comfortable with the term indigenous. I mean, that's why I'm interested in works that are trying to theorize new concepts, new ways of being. I mean, what I'm interested in is this more sort of popular slogan of sort of another world is possible, right? I mean, I'm trying to find ways of making these other worlds possible. I mean, the squatter settlements, again, I'm trying to say this again without trying to romanticize this, but the squatter settlements, the way people live there, it's I don't know what else to call it. It's a very organic process. So there are networks that you become a part of. So you migrate to the city. I mean, the Kurdish migration doesn't work that way, but the previous migration of 60s and 70s is a chain migration. So you come to the city, you find, you are integrated into the city through your networks, through the people that you know from your own region, right? You find jobs, you find housing through these networks, and you develop strategies of surviving in the city, right? And that is a particular way of being in the city, right? And in that sense, it is, I don't know what else to use, an organic way of, so it unfolds, right? It develops, and you have a certain way of being in the city. But with these urban transformation projects, I mean, such top-down projects, without taking into account any of that unfolding and any of those mechanisms or strategies of surviving in the city, you completely shatter this social system. I mean, call it whatever, indigeneity or, I mean, mechanisms of survival, let's put it that way. So you completely shatter the mechanisms of survival in the city overnight. And it's very difficult, it is possible, but very difficult to rebuild the kind of, perhaps resilience, the kind of survival strategies that these people have developed over time. So when I refer to indigeneity, I'm talking about, I'm more referring to survival strategies that have developed over time and more organically in a way. Does that answer your question? No.
It is complex, actually. I'm not expecting one clear answer because it doesn't exist, actually. But I'm wondering exactly, we're working in this way. We're comparing some movements in Campania with some movements in the Amazon, that at the end, what they have in common is the struggle for life, let's say, within the environment. So it's very interesting, this approach on the survival. And for sure not essentializing the indigenous condition as one social category that's ready-made and to use. And so
what I'm trying to do is Because when you look at the debates in urban sociology or urban anthropology in Turkey, immediately people problematize squatter settlements as settlements that need to be rehabilitated. There's something wrong with them. So what I'm arguing is that there are things that we can learn from these settlements. I mean, we shouldn't romanticize them, but there are things that we can learn from these settlements, and there's nothing wrong with upgrading the housing conditions of the people, but you have to take into account their survival strategies and how they survive. I mean, no one talks to these people when they completely relocate them. So that's what I'm trying to get at. I mean, there are things that we can learn from the squatter settlements rather than immediately problematizing them and normalizing gated communities. I don't know who's giving
Thanks a lot, Ayfer hocam. That was a highly inspiring, brilliant speech. My name is Etemcan. I'm from Istanbul Policy Center, as most of you know. I took just so many notes to comment on because, I mean, it was very rich in detail, I mean, your presentation. But I would like to start with an example that's very close to my heart, since you've mentioned all those projects about Istanbul with use of water and so on and so forth. I'm from Ankara, as many of you know, and so very recently we had this very terrible TV advertisement on a project called Marina Ankara with Hülya Avşar and her daughter, who's a big pop singer, and actually they are telling that, oh, mom, shall I just sign up for an Ankara university? And then she says, well, there is no sea in Ankara, because unfortunately Ankara is a landlocked city, and eventually this project promises to bring a sea to Ankara, which they are actually extracting from a big river nearby that will actually cut the veins that go to the last public lake in Ankara, which is Ottu Lake anyway. So I think it's just a common pattern that's kind of developing, and this has a lot to do with the whole accumulation system and accumulation strategy. But what I really wanted to mention was about this, the projects that you've mentioned from Zaha Hadid, and the whole notion of this helicopter ride and taking a superior view. Because I think this resonates well with something else that you've mentioned about cleaning up around the Olympic Stadium. So there is this godlike features of urban transformation. So someone basically have a vision, goes through the city with a helicopter, sees something, says, well, we changed this, we cleaned this up. And I think this goes hand in hand with what has happened during Habitat summits previously in Turkey, then with NATO summits in 2000s, and probably with G20 this year, that we will see there is this cleanup of the city, be it from migrants, be it from the stray animals, be it from the poor communities. And this is the Olympic Stadium, I think, is a good example on that. So I'm reminded of when you showed this, like this godlike feature of the speech by China Miéville called Limits of Utopia. And actually there, he mentions that we shouldn't necessarily think that utopias are actually for good, because there may be very bad utopias, and actually what we live now is one of them, because actually this is the utopia of the ruling class. So this is the kind of godlike strength they have. They fly over with helicopters, they see something, and they have the financial, economic, political power to change things. So the question is, well, how does the reconfiguration of the social, physical, cultural aspects come together to stop this beyond being reactionary attempts?
I think you do have a panel. Unfortunately, I won't be able to join you for the rest of the week. I'm leaving for Germany tomorrow morning. You do have a panel on radical democracy, and you will have people from Rojava, right? I think Rojava experience is really important. I mean, I'm not just going to give Rojava as an example, but I mean, there are, I think in parts of Kurdistan, there are experiments with alternative ways of organizing a society. In Istanbul, I think Gezi protest and park was part of that, partly an answer to that. I mean, first you have to say, stop, enough, right? And that's what Gezi Park was about. And it was really interesting, you know, when that happens and how that happens, because 6 months prior to Gezi Park demonstrations, there was another call by the same group of people, Taksim Solidarity, for Gezi Park, the same issue, the same group of people calling people to the park. We were just around 100 people in the park. I mean, that's really, for me, one of the most interesting things about Gezi Park protests. So what happened in those 6 months that actually made people say, enough, and I'll be there? I mean, we were all caught off guard. I mean, you know, all of us on the streets were not expecting that, right? Anyway, that's another discussion, but I think that's important in terms of also social movements. What happened in those 6 months that actually triggered that, right? So I think that's, in that sense, I take protests or movements like Gezi Park very important, and it was reactionary, but first you need that reaction, right? Which you didn't have 6 months. I mean, there were different movements, neighborhood movements, this and that, but just as a collective movement, that was important. So that was a sort of the stop message. But after that, no, I completely agree that there should be alternatives. There should be ways of talking about sort of alternative, again, making other worlds possible. But for me, as someone teaching and thinking about these issues and living in Istanbul, I take this sort of knowledge production seriously. That's one of the things that we do, right? So in that sense, I find sort of this turning this gaze to the upper classes very important. And rather than normalizing and aestheticizing the residential settlements of the upper classes, we need to produce more knowledge about those kinds of settlements. We should keep on talking about the problems of that rather than just problematizing squatter settlements. And I think in this sort of Anthropocene debate, I think we need more collaborative work of social anthropologists with more sort of engineers or physicists or material scientists. I mean, we need to count, we need to measure, we need to say something about the environmental damage of these kinds of gated communities. So we really need to, I think, provide a different framework within which to start imagining a new kind of city, right? I mean, this has been so much normalized. I mean, we can't even, I mean, now when I talk to some of my students, now that I'm getting older, it's becoming more and more difficult to talk to them about the problems of gated communities. Some of them, not many, some of them have been born in these gated communities, and they ask me, so what's wrong? What's your problem with these people? I said, I don't have a problem with the people. They think I have a problem with their parents. I don't. But they've normalized this so much. So it's a huge challenge to turn the table, really. But I think that's a very important starting point to even start imagining a different possible worlds. So that's, I mean, I'm aware that I'm just telling you a starting point. But I think Rojava example or some of the experimentations in Kurdistan, again, we should be careful not to romanticize all of these things, because I think, I mean, although they are providing a very powerful critique of capitalism and so on, we really need to see some of these projects in action, whether it's really happening or not. But there are very sort of proactive projects that are being implemented there. So I wish I could stay for that panel. But.
Hello, I'm Amelie from Entitled. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about resistance in these squatter settlements and the gated communities maybe as well. We've been told on a very amazing walking tour of some of the central urban transformation projects on Saturday that the initial movement of resistance, at least in central Istanbul, was a bit of an elite movement of urban intellectuals. Well, maybe not elite, but at least, a core of urban intellectuals. And we, of course, know that Gezi Park has become much broader and bigger than that, and has surely also, included a lot of the grassroots and maybe people from such spaces. But I was wondering if you could say something about both organized as well as everyday resistance in those spaces.
Yeah, resistance, that's a tough question for two reasons. I mean, not question, but as resistance movements. I mean, organizing resistance movements and who participates, who doesn't, and why not. Many scholars, when these urban transformation projects started, many scholars, activists were very excited about some of the neighborhood associations. And they were counting on resistance movements. It's going to happen now. It's the time for the revolution. It's going to happen now. But we saw that in some of these neighborhoods, although the resistance started, it failed. And I think it's important to understand why it failed. It has a lot to do with, and some people have written about this, Tuna Kuyucu from the sociology department here has several articles about this, why resistance and some of these neighborhood associations fail. It has to do with the legal structure and the property regime in the squatter settlements. Because they are not really homogeneous places in terms of population. Some people they own the property, some of them are renting the property, and some of them have these so-called legal documents that are quite shaky. So they have this document, paper, saying that they have the right to use the land. They don't own the house, but they have the right to use the land. But that document can easily be taken back from them. So they couldn't count on that as a legal document. So organizing or mobilizing a resistance movement in a neighborhood where you have this really mixed property regime, I mean, some people have more to lose than the others. I mean, they have to agree with the mass housing administration, otherwise they would be left with nothing, right? So one option is to agree to go along with the mass housing administration, and if they could pay, they could own the house, and maybe they'll survive. But they don't have the other option, and they don't have anything to count on. Well, the owners, or the ones who have a bit more proper title deed, they did resist. But they resist not because they were against the urban transformation project, but they wanted to have a better deal with the mass housing administration. So it's a very complicated picture. And the property regime has a lot to do with that, and the history of squatter settlement, what it means, and so on. So also we can't really romanticize, or we can't expect, or we can't be angry to people who didn't resist. They had all the good reasons not to. In that squatter settlement that we worked in, that was the first sort of naive question that I asked people. So why didn't you resist? And one of these people that I was interviewing, he said, well, are you Kurdish or Turkish? I said, I'm Turkish. He said, look, my dear, if I resist, I become a terrorist. If you resist, you become an activist. So I think that says obviously a lot about who can resist under what conditions. So it's very important, I think, to be self-reflexive about social class, ethnicity, and also the property regime, ownership, who owns what, and what kind of resistance can you mobilize around this puzzle. This doesn't mean that resistance cannot happen, but there are different conditions. So you can't be angry at people. I mean, during Gezi Park protests, everyone talks about whether the Kurds were there or not. I think the more interesting question is whether the neighborhood associations were there or not. Most of them were not there. And they would be the usual suspects, right? I mean, there's something happening in the urban context. People trying to protect an urban space, and you would expect neighborhood associations who are very active in their neighborhoods against urban transformation projects, they would be the usual suspects. But many of them were not there. And we need to understand why they were not there. And that has a long answer, but I think that that's an important question. So many people focus on, well, whether the Kurds were there or not, you know, this and that. But I find that sort of neighborhood association, what kind of solidarity we had during Gezi protests, I find that a more interesting question. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
I'm so grateful with your talk. I am from Ecuador. And even if you are not talking about Kurdish problem as if they were indigenous, but you are talking about a minority, and in some way it works in the same way, and your framing is useful for everybody. So one of the things that inspire me is how to think about culture, because sometimes we say or we thought that this kind of state strategy to appropriation of land or having advantage about the rent, etc., all of this economic interesting behind this or this modernization project or capitalist strategy is destroying culture. The first impression is that, okay, the objective could be to destroy to the other, no? Indigenous or the culture of the indigenous people or the culture of the Kurds. But I think that the objective is to destroy the material base of how they organize or they organize themselves in order to survive. And that it was so visible in your case. No, they don't care about the culture at all. At the end, if they change the material basis of how they organize themselves to survive, to produce, then they exacerbate and destroy the culture. So I think it could be interesting. That is what I received from you, not how to think about culture when capitalism is so aggressive and all the system is acting and using the discourse and the legally instruments to appropriate on the material way of organize the social life, whatever it is.
Yeah. Actually, that's what I would also call culture. Yeah, I mean the ways of, I mean that's part of urban culture. Or cultures. I mean, there is no one urban culture, right? I mean, that in a way, that is what we are losing in this process. This kind of transformation. So I think I'm saying that I agree with you that it is a way of destroying culture, not in the sense of the sort of romantic view of culture, but in how people socially organize themselves in the city. You know, think of a migrant. That is the culture that they produce in the city, right? So we can't really think of an essentialist culture, right? But so this way of existence, the survival strategy is what I would call culture and what many anthropologists call culture, working in the urban field. So that is what actually we are losing. Not the sort of folkloric, essentialized view of culture, but the sort of survival strategies that people have developed over time. And that's what I try to explain when I say it's organic. Again, if you could offer a better term, I'd be very happy. I mean, the sort of more sort of organic unfolding of, again, surviving in the city. How do you do that? So that's what's happening, I think.
Hi, I'm Ibrahim, a master's student from University of Manchester. I'm one of these places Thanks very much. This inspirational speech and place. I was born in one of these gecekondu plays, and the question how people survive, basically, as Ayfer said, people have no alternative other than have solidarity. When as capitalism has its own illness, there's unemployment, especially in this sort of area, or low wages, people go and buy in the corner shop without paying. In a way, it's a credit system. In order to move them into another place, as state and the state authority blames these people as terrorism or drug dealing or prostitution, seeing all these evils in this sort of area. But unfortunately, that is not the case. As we can see on the screen, these people are the people of the working class, sons and daughters, and they express their oppressions through Gezi Park. That's one of the interpretation of the Gezi Park. And it is evident, it is not the need of the people, that's why they are moving, but it is the profiting from urbanization or urban transformation, unfortunately. Therefore, the social movements, some of the colleagues are asking, it seems we are not left any more options other than overthrowing this oppressive regime. One way or the another, we have to stand, we have to struggle, and we are in resistance. It is not only academia, just speaking here, but we are in resistance in everyday life, one way or another. We are resisting, and I believe we will, one way or another, we will win.
Well, thank you for your optimistic note. As I said, I mean, last month I wouldn't agree this much, but this month I do. After the elections, I do. But I also want to add something. I think rightly so, as academics, activists, or people living in these neighborhoods, we have been concentrating, focusing on people who have been losing in this process, in urban transformation projects. But there are so many people who see themselves as winning in this process. And I think it's also important to understand why they see themselves as winning. I mean, I don't agree. I mean, I think we're all losing in this process, but we need to understand, because that was one of the shocks in previous elections. How come the ruling party managed to get so many votes from also working class neighborhoods, or lower middle class neighborhoods, or middle class neighborhoods? In that public housing project that I showed you, we also interviewed people who moved there from another squatter settlement, which is not a Kurdish settlement, but they are coming from the Black Sea coast. So in terms of squatter settlements, this group is also coming from a squatter settlement, but they're a bit of a more lower middle class. They have a bit of a more stable jobs, but they didn't want to see the Kurds around them. They were so happy when the Kurds left. And they saw themselves as actually winning in this process. So they managed to own an apartment building in this new settlement and managed to kick the Kurds out. So they were quite happy, and they were voting for AKP because they saw themselves as winning in this process. So we shouldn't really have this picture of sort of squatter settlements versus the ruling party in a way. Because there are also differences within, as I said, there's a sort of social stratification within squatter settlements, and also there are ethnic differences. And they are very important in terms of, you know, who can live together with whom and under what conditions.
Okay.
Okay. My question is not in the central part of your presentation, perhaps not your expertise, but I want, at the beginning you said about this trauma with ecological anthropology, so I wanted to hear why was it so traumatic, because I've read some of them and I like them, so I want to understand why anthropologists were traumatized by them. I like the work of Marvin Harris, the witches and the pigs and all these things, and then he has, for example, some arguments. He says, okay, the Aztecs were eating humans in huge sacrifices because they lacked protein and because the ecosystems could not support animals. So I can understand that this is a little bit deterministic, but I don't understand why is it traumatic. And I'm trying to understand whether there are anthropologists today that are trying to get something useful out of this type of ecological anthropology, because I think there are nice things that they're trying to understand how the ecosystems and our adaptation to them affect certain social practices. Yeah. I think one more, yeah.
Thank you, Ashish Kothari from India. I just came in, so hello to everybody. The process you described about gated colonies and what's happening, it's actually so similar to what's happening in India, which you may be familiar with. And also, again, this, the imagery of green housing and wake up to the call of birds and stuff like that. I mean, it's all very similar. I don't think I haven't seen an advertisement as blatant as the one that you showed at the end, but they're fairly similar. What I was wondering was whether you have developed, or it's possible to actually maybe have some collaboration on developing the sort of, in terms of the principles and values of what would be an organic city process or urbanization process. I like the word organic, I think I'm fine with that, versus what's being imposed. So for instance, resilience versus fragility, at least in terms of the poor people and the environment. Direct radical democracy versus imposed technocratic, if one can even call it democracy or whatever, rule. And so on, so that we're actually able to develop a narrative which may be able to appeal to a much larger number of people, not just the victims, but also others. So I don't know if you actually develop something like that. Any thoughts on that would be very useful. Thanks.
Well, I haven't really developed a full-scale sort of that kind of a framework, but that is in a way what I'm also simultaneously trying to work on. I mean, I've been collaborating with Teresa Caldeira, who works on Sao Paulo on gated communities, and but I mean, I concentrated for a long time on, although there is this international literature on gated communities, it's very recent that we actually started discussing that in the Turkish case. So that has been part of my effort and energy, trying to problematize gated communities and trying to talk about why it's a problem. But what you're suggesting is very important. That's why I think of the Kurdistan case as very important in terms of sort of grassroots mobilization, alternative ways of creating cities and so on. But that discussion also needs to take into account workings of capitalism. Some of the exercises that I've heard and suggestions that I've heard are, I think, I mean, I shouldn't call them naive, but it doesn't really engage with the workings of capitalism. So it's tough, it's difficult, but it's worth trying, and also looking at different examples in different parts of the world, and theorizing and coming up with alternatives. I mean, right now I don't have that kind of a framework, but that's really, I think, the way to go, really. In terms of Marvin Harris, we're not really traumatized by Marvin Harris, but the trauma has more to do with, I would say, history of anthropology, in a way, especially history of physical anthropology. And its complicity in colonialism, racism, and all that. And also, I mean, the kind of work ecological anthropologists have been accused of reductionism, not asking any additional questions regarding power, history, colonialism, and so on. So I think that's part of the problem. But I think what happened in many anthropology departments, I mean, I'm more familiar with the North American context is that they had what I call nasty divorce. They stopped talking to one another at some point. I mean, when I was a graduate student in the 1990s, there wasn't any ongoing conversation. I mean, I went to Berkeley, and we heard that when I was there, Stanford, they split the departments. They just split the department into two. More sort of physical anthropologists and social anthropologists, and they stopped talking to one another. It's only recently that they reunited. I mean, that also obviously has a lot to do with the use of resources and so on. The dean, I think, pushed them to do that. But it was really a very nasty divorce that they had. But I think now that's why, I thought Anthropocene debate is interesting, because it is calling for a new kind of dialogue between social anthropology and physical and natural sciences, let me put it that way. And I think, Anna Singh, I think Povinelli and many people are actually going in that direction. And what they are going back to is not necessarily Marvin Harris kind of questions, but probably posing new kinds of questions, but trying to have a conversation with the two. And I think the problem is that kind of end of dialogue between ecological anthropologists and others, social anthropologists, also had a lot of damage, I think. Because now I think that the pendulum really went the other way. Now I asked some of my graduate students, for example, they've been doing some work on urban transformation. They talk about subjectivity, governmentality, all this sort of high theory. And I asked them, well, how many people live in this neighborhood? They can't answer that question. They are so much in this sort of high theory, this and that, and Deleuze and Foucault and so on. But, these are really basic questions. I'm trying to convince some students to actually count, measure the amount of water that is consumed in one neighborhood, right? They shy away from that. I think that, it has to do with that still. I think the consequence, children are suffering from the nasty divorce, let me put it that way. I think it's time to go back, and I'm very excited about collaborative work. We can ask new and common sort of questions that will be exciting for everyone who are part of the project, taking into account of history, capitalism, colonialism, but counting, measuring, and doing also that kind of research as well. But still, that's a challenge, let me tell you. They can go on and on about subjectivity, but would have difficulty telling you how many people live in that neighborhood, or what they eat, for example.
Okay. Thank you, Ayfer, for this really inspiring talk.
And so on and so forth. This is also another contested area. What do we call ourselves? Well, many people refuse to call themselves anything. They just call themselves anthropologists working on environmental issues. But I think at least this distinction is actually very useful. Ecological anthropology versus environmental anthropology. Although just keeping in mind that many anthropologists even refuse to call themselves environmental anthropology because we have a trauma. Every discipline has a trauma. The trauma has to do with the kind of ecological anthropology that has been conducted in 1960s and 70s. So this was really a traumatic and very tense relationship between social anthropologists and ecological anthropologists. Some of them were biological anthropologists, physical anthropologists, and physical anthropology, even the name itself, could be quite traumatic for many social anthropologists, because when you think of the history of anthropology, physical anthropology has this unfortunate history of being associated with racism, colonialism, and all those bad things. So, ecological anthropologists, some of them were physical anthropologists, biological anthropologists, and the kind of anthropology's engagement with environment was very much had a particular vision in 1960s and 70s. It was very much a positivist science. It defined itself as a positivist science, and it didn't have anything to do with social anthropology. So it was mainly talking about adaptive strategies, You know, how much rainfall will determine a certain cultural behavior. It's very much environmentally deterministic studies, and talking a lot about these adaptive strategies, how much calorie people intake of calories, how much they consume, and so on and so forth. And the unit of analysis was really the sort of a village, or their people, their own people, the sort of small-scale societies, and they could tell you everything you want to know about the physical conditions, the environmental conditions, with no relevance, with no concern whatsoever about questions of power, questions about the world system, questions about inequality, questions about gender. So that was really how ecological anthropology, or anthropologists who were dealing with some form of environmental issues, worked within that paradigm of 1960s and 70s. Well, when we look at more sort of contemporary anthropologists working on environmental issues, it's a completely different picture. And we're not talking about the same group of people who changed their minds. We're talking about a completely different groups of people, academics. So there is this emergence of new, I don't think it's a generational thing, but still a new generation of anthropologists dealing with environmental issues, but asking completely different kinds of questions. Very much influenced by geography, very much influenced by the world system, very much influenced.
It's an anthropological category.
Huh? What? That's an exotic category? Okay. Where is it? Irmak is here. No? Oh, okay. Buna mı basıyorum ilerlemek için? Tamam. Okay. So what I'm going to do is, I'll try to do several things at the same time. I hope this will work out. In the first maybe 10 minutes, maybe less than that, well, 10 minutes, what I'll do is give you a sense of, I'm not sure how much you're familiar with anthropology. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. But I'll try to give you a sense of what I call anthropology's engagement with the environment, how in contribution that anthropology and the debates in anthropology can have for environmental discussions. And also, I was just telling Jason that I will have a different take on the Anthropocene debate, but we'll also talk about that later. So I thought I could just give you a sense of some of the things that are being debated within anthropology, obviously in conversation with geographers, political ecologists, and other fields as well. So give you a sense of that and mention a couple of names whose work I find quite exciting and interesting, although I don't agree with all of the things that they are doing. And then move on with some examples from the work that I've been conducting, not only in Istanbul, but I'll also talk about the other life that I had, previous work, research, and I'll give you through examples from my own research. I'll also try to demonstrate some of these contributions that I want to highlight. And I think many of the things that I want to just throw out will raise a series of questions that hopefully we can discuss during the discussion. So I'll start with this naming, labels, ecological anthropology versus environmental anthropology. So what do anthropologists call themselves when they work on environmental issues? So this is well, in anthropology, everything is very highly contested. This is of ordinary people in our discussions and debates about nature, environment, and so on. Because all these big concepts like social class, gender, they are very much lived experiences. I mean, we are talking about real people in specific historical settings doing things, right? So that is really, that sounds very mundane and ordinary, but that's really, I think, the power of anthropology as well. But there are a couple of other issues which I think I'll just list some of them. Contributions, discussions, and debates these are ongoing debates and ongoing research taking these questions seriously. One has to do with question of scale. We did come a long way from just talking about our little communities, face-to-face communities, villages. Anthropologists are famous, talking about their own villages, their own sites, and so on. Yes, we still do that, but obviously we're not under the impression that there is this tiny little locality that has nothing to do with the rest of the world. So there are various attempts by many anthropologists trying to problematize the scale. So we talk about this local-global nexus, so what it means to be local, what it means to be global, and the intersections between them, north and south, indigenous versus foreign, or indigenous or non-Western versus Western. So we actually problematize many of these, what some call question of scale. So these notions that people assume and people expect from anthropologists, this locality, let's hear about the local, right? So anthropologists, rather than assuming what local is or what locality is, we try to conduct work, or they try to demonstrate what we can say production of locality, the historical production of locality, and also production of globality. So rather than just understanding local and with its own histories and so on, and just thinking of global as something that is coming and just changing everything, so now we try to understand the production of both what we mean by globality, and I think Jason's talk was very informative in that sense. We can't just assume that. We need to historicize that. We need to talk about real actors. We need to talk about different forms that capitalism takes in different regions of the world. So we really started talking about, rather than assuming this distinction itself, talking about production of locality and production of globality. So rather than, again, talking about exotic, pristine, untouched people, again, thinking of Eric Wolf, people without history, and there were never in history people who haven't been untouched or haven't been part of either a regional or a global network of exchange, interaction, and so on. I mean, it took on different forms, obviously. So that's one of the influenced by work of geographers, political ecologists, and so on. And I think geographers and political ecologists and economists also started learning a lot from anthropology. So there is this convergence of social scientists. I'm sure you're all familiar with that history. Convergence of social scientists who, that's why political ecology is so attractive, because it brings together all these different disciplines. Geographers discovering, in a way, fieldwork methodology as a new methodology, sort of rediscovering anthropology. Anthropologists discovering geographers, talking about space, place, things are happening in a place, there are histories, there's a global history, and so on. So the kind of environmental anthropology, I'm just using it as a shortcut, the kind of environmental anthropology, or the kind of anthropology that I'll be talking about today, is drastically different from this ecological anthropology of 1960s and 70s. So the kinds of questions that we are engaged now, this group of anthropologists, as I said, it's really, you can think of it as this area of political ecology, inequalities, gender, and so on. And there have been many influences there. Different theories about nature, science studies had a lot of impact in organizing this field. Development studies, feminist theory, environmental history, post-colonial studies, political ecology. So this environmental anthropology that is conducted now is very much, they feed on these different theories as well. So these are just a background information influences and the dramatic differences in the contemporary anthropology, the way we deal with environmental issues. Let me say a couple of things very briefly about again, what kind of contributions or what are the ongoing debates and issues that are that anthropology, the kind of anthropology that I just told you about, anthropology can bring to discussions of environmental issues. Well, one has to do with, I think, methodology. Fieldwork methodology, as I said, has been very attractive as a methodology, looking at everyday life practices, hearing the stories of ordinary people, how they go about in their daily lives, how they interact with the environment, what they do, what they believe in, how they live, how they are integrated into the world system, and so on. So this methodology, I think, again, we don't need a longer discussion on this at the moment, but this fieldwork methodology has been, I think, one of the important contributions when we think of anthropology and its engagement with the environment. And it brings in the stories of and the experience.
Okay. So I would like to introduce you my colleague here at Bogazici University, Ayfer Bartu Candan. So when we were organizing the summer school, fellows asked for an anthropologist specifically. And so here we have our anthropologist, and she is here at Bogazici University at the Department of Sociology, and her research interests mainly include urban anthropology, political anthropology, space, power, and gender. And she has very good work on Istanbul as well, and I'm sure she will be telling us a bit this during the session as well. So the floor is yours. Thanks.
First, I'll start by sitting and then I'll stand up. Well, thank you very much for inviting me and insisting to have an anthropologist. But when I first heard that from Begüm, I was a bit worried because I wasn't sure what you were expecting, insisting on anthropology. And this worry has to do with usually the expectations from anthropology, because when people think of anthropology still, given the changes and transformations in the discipline and all the debate and so on, still when many people think of anthropology, they think of these exotic places, exotic people, you know, anthropologists telling us about all these stories that we're not familiar with. Well, I'm not going to do that. I'm not that kind of an anthropologist, and I don't think anthropology should be conducted in that way. And I'll certainly come back to this observation later on. Of course, I will be talking about different worlds and how a different world is possible and what anthropology could contribute to that debate. But certainly I'm not going to be talking about exotic places and people and exotic stories. And that is also usually the general division of labor in social sciences. I did my graduate studies in the States. The division of labor that exists there is sociologists deal with North America, anthropologists deal with the rest of the world. So, and sociologists talk about structures, economy, serious things, and anthropologists talk about the fancy, exotic, irrelevant things. You know, they add touches, colors, and texture, and so on. So that's not the kind of anthropology that I try to do. And anyway, we'll come back to that in a minute. So what I thought I could do is, I'm a Mac person, so I'm paralyzed when I.